Good morning, Patti.
Good morning, Sarah.
I'm Sarah Posner, and this is the Posner Show. And today my guest is Patti Miller, my colleague at Religion Dispatches and the author of the book, Good Catholics, The Battle Over Abortion in the Catholic Church. Pick up your own copy. It is a really fascinating history of the movement to create a pro-choice Catholic movement in the United States and abroad. And just some really fascinating stuff in there. And also the sections on the political rise of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops around the issue of abortion and contraception is also invaluable. So we're going to talk a little bit about the book, but Patti's here with me today to talk about very current happenings in the Catholic Church, particularly this 10-day long,
2-week
long meeting in Rome. The Extraordinary Synod on family life.
On the family life, right?
On family life. So it's created a lot of controversy and discussion in the Catholic world, but just for people who aren't following this very closely, just can you give us a little backgrounder on what the Synod is, how it came about, what it aims to do?
Well, the Synod was called by Pope Francis to discuss family life in the Catholic Church, really a recognition by Francis when he became Pope that it's what the Catholic Church calls the family life issues, which is divorce and contraception and how gay and lesbian Catholics are treated. All these sex-related issues, basically, are really what's driven a lot of people away from the Catholic Church and really has made the Catholic Church seem an anachronism in the modern world. So he called all the bishops together. It is called an Extraordinary Synod for a reason. It's an extraordinary gathering, specifically to talk about maybe if not revising doctrine, how that doctrine can be better presented to Catholics in the modern world. So it really had political undertones from the beginning because you don't call this synod unless you want to make some changes in the church.
So you think that ultimately Francis's aim is to make doctrinal changes, or is ultimately his aim to make more pastoral changes where there may not necessarily be a change in doctrine, but Catholics who are, say, gay or divorced or don't, fit within the doctrinal constrictions on sex and sexuality will still feel welcome going to Mass and participating in parish life?
That's really what he's indicated, that he wants to make pastoral changes, that there's a lot of leeway to do that without changing doctrine. It's not clear that that's, I think, one of the reasons there's been so much conservative pushback is the fear that those pastoral changes, if they become widespread enough, could kind of lead backwards to doctrinal changes in the long run. So there's a reason this has been pretty controversial because they really do see those pastoral changes, as I wrote, as maybe the pastoral cart kind of leading the doctrinal horse in the long run.
But are there fears? Are these fears by the traditionalists, by the conservatives, a little bit misplaced? I mean, in the sense that it would take a lot to change the doctrine. It would take, generational changes in the appointment of bishops and priests.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just sort of seems like it's perhaps a long-term potential change as opposed to a sudden and cataclysmic one.
It sure is. And I think that's really accurate. But one thing I've come to learn from watching the Catholic Church for a while is they really think long term. One reason the Catholic Church is it works on a completely different time frame than normal humans work. They're thinking generationally. They really are. The conservatives have taken great comfort in the fact that for 35 years, there's really been a doctrinal homogeny in the Catholic Church. And the real bottom line word from the bishops is nothing is going to change and nothing is ever going to change. So even the idea of changing pastoral practice to them is really disturbing because they are looking a generation or two down the line.
But haven't recent appointments, well, I'm thinking of Kupich, pronounce his name, the new archbishop, the newly installed archbishop of Chicago, his focus is less on the political stuff and more on the pastoral stuff. And even Kurtz, who's the relatively new president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, his focus, or he's talked more about pastoral life than political issues. Not that he's completely shied away from political issues, but isn't the pastoral versus doctrinal divide the hallmark, really, of Francis's papacy?
It really is. And I think he's really trying to say we can do this without changing doctrine. And I personally believe he's correct. I do believe that the conservatives' fears are misplaced, but I think that's why they have had such a strong reaction to these proposals.
Okay. Now, you wrote a couple of pieces at RD. One was Rest in Peace, the Contraceptive Mentality. So what was it out of the synod that made you write that?
Well, before they even released the midterm report that was so surprising in its language about gays in the church, the bishops there in their first kind of roundup of where they were at really acknowledged that they were using language that was turning Catholics off. And the three phrases that they really said they realized were a big no-no were intrinsically disordered for gay people and living in sin, which is just kind of a cultural anachronism. And the third phrase that they said that they wanted to back away from was the contraceptive mentality, which was a hallmark of John Paul II's kind of whole doctrine of feminist participation in the Catholic Church, really.
Okay, tease that out a little bit. You talk about this in the book too. The John Paul II's view of women's role. He was not obviously the first pope to start discussing these issues, but he kind of consolidated a lot of this view of feminism, contraception, tying contraception to abortion, tying contraception with, basically kind of like modern life for women, and making it into this package of, things that Catholic women shouldn't do.
Right. And he conflated that under his famous culture of death, which, kind of sounds like the Death Star or something. He put contraception and abortion really into the same basket for Catholics and said, although contraception isn't as bad, obviously, people who contracept are using the same mentality as people who would have an abortion, and it could even lead you to have an abortion. Really going back to some early Catholic thinkers from the early 60s that said a woman who used contraception would reject their children and ruin their marriages, and a whole basket of kind of dire predictions if contraception became widespread. And he really infused that thinking into all of his papacy, and it really changed how the Catholic Church viewed contraception from kind of a necessary evil. It tolerated it, knew people were using it, to something that they really felt the need to eventually speak out strongly against, for instance, in insurance coverage and things like that, that really directly led, as I've written, to the Hobby Lobby case. They really were the first to take such a hard line against contraception. Emergency contraception became the perfect tool because it did kind of embody that conflation of abortion and contraception that John Paul had been so big on.
Right. Even though, as I think we've both written about, the emergency contraception at issue in the Hobby Lobby case is not, as Hobby Lobby alleged, an abortifacient, but in the court's mind, it didn't matter whether it was or not.
That's correct.
It was what the sincerely held religious belief of Hobby Lobby was. So there is obviously an ongoing divide between the theology, let's say, of emergency contraception and the medicine of emergency contraception, and what constitutes an abortion and what constitutes a pregnancy even. So I think that this is sort of an interesting discussion in terms of like the periods of time over which changes happen in the Catholic Church, because you're talking about how in the early 60s there was this view, and then in 1968 Humanae Vitae was published. And in the book you talk about this, that there were opponents of Humanae Vitae. They were, they were basically shot down, and obviously we have Humanae Vitae now. And then over time, it became consolidated with the idea of abortion and what John Paul II called the culture of death. But we're talking decades. The evolution of all of this took decades. So But I think that it's not, I mean, I think among Catholics or people who follow the Catholic Church closely, the dissent over Humanae Vitae was very well known. But can you give us a little background on that and how that went down? Because I think it's sort of an interesting historical backdrop to what's going on now and whether doctrinal changes will take place and what is the status of Catholics who dissent to church teaching. So I think it's an interesting backdrop to all of that.
Well, what's so interesting is when Humanae Vitae was released, there was a huge amount of dissent from it, not just from Catholics, but from the bishops' conferences, most of the major European bishops' conferences, as well as the U.S. Bishops' Conference, right away wrote formal dissents from that, which nowadays would be unimaginable for someone to do that, really. If you look at the people dissenting from this midterm report for the Synod, it's just little whispers, but they wrote formal doctrinal condemnations of Humanae Vitae. The American bishops were very much in the forefront of that.
And just to interject, sorry, Humanae Vitae is the encyclical banning the use of contraception.
Oh, contraception, yes, which was released in 1968 after the widespread belief that the Catholic Church was actually going to liberalize the teaching. So it was really a shocker. The Pope's own birth control commission had recommended that the Church liberalize the teaching. So no one really expected it. And theologically, it just didn't really have much basis, which is why all the bishops' conferences and a group of about 800 of the world's best-known Catholic theologians dissented from it. They just said there is really no reason we can't change this teaching. It really was about the Church's authority. They were afraid if they changed it, they would lose all their authority on sex-related issues. The U.S. Bishops' Conference, ironically, the last time there was a family synod in 1980 under Pope John Paul II, really talked about exactly what Pope Francis is talking about now, a pastoral application of the doctrine, which was, sure, you could tell people about the ban on birth control, but if Catholics really felt that they, in good conscience, needed to use a modern method of birth control, you could kind of look the other way. It certainly wouldn't bar their participation in the church. They were really, really smacked down for that in 1980. And that was the beginning of the end of kind of discussion in the church, which is why this synod is really so important, even if there aren't huge changes that come out of it, because there is discussion happening, which hasn't happened really since 1980 about these issues.
Wow. So, and it's totally up to the Pope to call a synod. So,
yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about this midterm report. So this report coming out of the synod, so the synod is made up of bishops, lay leaders as well?
They're just advisors. There's lay, they call them auditors, but they're just advisors. They can speak, but they don't get to really have a hand in the formulation of the final document.
Okay, so the bishops are going to create some sort of report following this, and that will go to the Pope and the Pope's people. And then what happens to the report?
Well, then there's going to be another synod next fall in Philadelphia in the fall of 2015. So this whole process is just a run-up to actually another synod. The Catholic Church does not do anything quickly. It's all a very drawn-out process.
The report that comes out of this one that's happening now in Rome will not be anything final.
No, and it's just advisory because it's really up to the Pope to make the final decisions about changing even pastoral practices.
So he's basically taking the temperature of around the world. Okay.
And I think he's also being very smart. He's not just taking the temperature, but I think he's trying to build some agreement. He's trying to see where there's places of agreement on these controversial issues that he can put forth some solutions that will have some widespread support in the church.
Okay, so let's talk about this midterm report. There were three things in it that you described as surprising, and this was what they said about the continued use of intrinsically disordered language to describe LGBT people, the living in sin language, and the contraceptive mentality. So this was surprising, and I think that Catholic LGBT advocates were very cheered by this because it signaled not just a welcoming of LGBT people into the parish and into church life, but potentially, are they thinking that potentially this might lead to a change in how the church describes homosexuality?
I don't know if they're being that optimistic. I think again, because that's doctrine, and because that would have to be, it is to me unimaginable that that would change in the lifetime of anyone on this planet right now. Certainly, if the contraception teaching can't change, they're both very closely tied to Humanae Vitae, because what Humanae Vitae held on to was the idea that sex is really only sanctified by procreation, even if it's just the possibility of procreation by using not very good birth control. So there is no way they are going to sanctify homosexual relationships. It goes against really a core Catholic doctrine. But what people were so cheered by was the language that said that gay and lesbian Catholics have gifts to bring to the church. And it was posed as a question, can we welcome them to the church? And people felt very cheered by that language for obvious reason. It's much nicer thing to be welcomed to the church for your gifts than to be called intrinsically disordered. And the other thing was, even more shocking in a way, is that they acknowledge that gay partnerships have value, that people are in committed partnerships, that they use some Vaticanese language that provide moral support to each other. But they recognize that these are marriage-like partnerships. That's very shocking for the Vatican. And I think that's the language the conservatives are really going to try to beat down this weekend when they meet to hash out a final document.
The conservatives within the
within the synod, because that language to acknowledge that gay partnerships have worth, even if the church never changes its teaching about gay marriage, is pretty revolutionary.
Now, I'm obviously not following this as closely as you are, but I got a sense from just checking in on what was going on this week, that there was some kind of, after this document came out, there was some kind of pushback from the Vatican on how people were interpreting this.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always this kind of back and forth play. Right. Something comes out, and then everybody's like, "Oh, this is so revolutionary," and then the Vatican, somebody within the Vatican says, "Well, we didn't really mean that. We meant this."
Right.
So what happened here with regard to that? What was the level of the pushback from within?
I don't know if it was really pushback. They clarified that it was a working document and that the language wasn't final. What the conservative bishops want to add on is like an addendum to that language but gay people are still really disordered, and as by the way. So they acknowledge that those discussions are still ongoing.
Okay. And so what about the contraceptive mentality? Was that something our conservatives, traditionalists, are they upset by that language in this midterm report, which isn't final or binding, obviously, but
right. Well, in terms of contraception, this was pretty conservative, although they said the acknowledgement that they had to get rid of that language wasn't actually in the midterm report. It was actually in a briefing a little bit before the report. But what they said in the midterm report was that basically the church should promote natural family planning. So what they're doing is suggesting swapping out the language of the contraceptive mentality with the promotion of natural family planning, which is still obviously light years away from where most Catholics are. As the only people they had testify to the synod about contraception were couples who were advocates of natural family planning. So that was obviously the answer that they wanted to hear. That's their pastoral solution, I suppose, that we don't want to talk about the evils of contraception. We want to talk about the beauty of natural family planning.
That's emphasizing the positive as opposed to the negative. Right. But the fact remains, though, that Humanae Vitae is the teaching of the church.
Exactly. So, and that the words contraceptive mentality are in an official papal encyclical, one of John Paul's landmark encyclicals. So that's not something you just dismiss overnight, quite honestly.
Okay. So that would take some doing, but this is very.
Right.
It seems like they're trying to be very Francis about this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're not going to change the doctrine, but we're going to try to be more welcoming, and the way we're doing that is to talk about the gifts of gay people, and we're going to talk about the beauty of natural family planning instead of emphasizing that contraception is the equivalent to a culture of death, essentially, right?
That's correct. And I think for anyone who grew up in the Catholic Church in maybe the 70s, like I did, this would be a Catholic Church that's very familiar. Like, there were rules, sure, but no one took them all that seriously. Really, the bigger emphasis was on how people live their lives, and were they good to other people and tried to worry about the poor and worry about the larger impact of their lives. It was a very pastoral kind of gospel, Jesus-like way of teaching about Catholicism. There really wasn't a lot of emphasis on, the rule book, on this, you have to follow this rule and that rule. So for people who don't remember that church, this might seem a little shocking, but that's, for a long time, it was kind of a let live kind of Catholicism.
Right. And that was in the wake of Vatican II. So another controversy that's come out of the Synod this week was the conservative Catholic, traditionalist Catholic blogging world is on fire. I mean, I don't think that's an exaggeration. Over comments made by a German bishop, Casper. I don't remember his first name, Archbishop Casper, about the role of African bishops in shaping or discussing the church's stance on homosexuality. And give us a little background on what Casper said, and then we can talk about how the traditionalist Catholics have reacted on the internet, at least.
Well, what Casper said, I think they've somewhat misconstrued what he said. What he said when he was asked about it was that the African bishops are obviously very conservative about homosexuality, as the culture is in general. What he said was it was a taboo subject to them, so they didn't speak of it. And as a result, their contributions on that section of the document were not really evident. The conservative bloggers took that to mean that the conservatives from Africa were basically blocked from offering their opinion on the issue of homosexuality, and that's why the report was so unexpectedly positive, because they were basically prevented from having a contribution. I think if you read what he said a little more closely, he said it was taboo to them and they could not discuss it. So it sounds like the European and the American bishops had that discussion, I guess, amongst themselves. And it's important to note that the people who drafted the report were mostly Europeans and Americans, including 6 perceived moderates who were appointed by Pope Francis last weekend at the last minute. So that's really where the discomfort is coming, is the feeling that Francis kind of packed the committee with moderates who put their point of view in and left out the more conservative third world bishops.
Interesting. So what Casper was saying was not that the African bishops were prevented from discussing this, but that they find it difficult or taboo to talk.
Taboo to discuss about it, yes.
And we exchanged links that we were reading about this topic this morning before we spoke, and I had been reading Rod Dreher and the American Conservative, and Matthew Schmitz, who's been a guest on this show with me of First Things, and you were reading Elizabeth Scalia at Patheos and Father Z at his
Father Z,
right? And it's interesting to me because Dreher talks a lot in his post about how, Catholicism and Christianity in general is moribund in Europe and it's exploding in Africa, and how dare they take this condescending view towards the African bishops when Africa and the developing world is the locus of burgeoning Catholicism, and it's dying in Europe. And it was just such it was like this interesting little microcosm in which to examine conservative views of what they perceive as the secularization of Europe, but then kind of throwing this back in the face of the liberals and the moderates and saying, you're the ones who are condescending to the non-European, non-Western world, and not the, you know what I'm saying? It was just like this very fascinating moment, and a little unfair to Casper, I think, as you point out. But I think it raised some of the issues that are kind of roiling the church right now, and I think some of them are quite legitimate in the sense that, things do seem to be dominated by the European and American and Western bishops, and there was a lot of talk before Francis was appointed Pope or elected pope, that there might be the first African pope, and that didn't come to pass, but we did have, a South American pope. So it's just like, it's interesting because I think a lot of Americans who sort of casually observe what goes on in the Catholic Church are not that aware that these are issues that are playing out and taking place with regard to, who is going to speak for the church, who is the future of the church in terms of leadership, when you do have increased secularization in Europe and a falling away of people being involved in church life. And you see an increase in that in Africa and in Latin America.
And it really is in some ways almost an irreconcilable divide, as happened in the Episcopalian Church. It really did cause a schism. The Europeans see liberalizing, at least the pastoral approach to the doctrine, as critical to reviving the church to any degree that it can be revived. And I think Pope Francis looks at America and realizes if they don't start to be more meeting Catholics where they are in their lives, they're going to see happen in this country what happened in Europe. Is people will just walk away. They already are. 1 in 3 Americans is an ex-Catholic, which is kind of amazing.
1 in 3 Americans?
No, not American. 1 in 3. I forget what the Pew survey said. Was it 1 in 3 Americans? That sounds really high now. But there's a large. I think 10% of all Americans are ex-Catholics. That's the number. It's a large number. So they really want to modernize to save the church in the West. But in the developing world, the church is doing just fine. They're very comfortable with the dogma. They're very much not only against homosexuality in Africa, but even the acceptance of contraception is low. So they are not pushing for doctrinal changes. The church is growing. The majority of priests are coming from that part of the world. But this is an old schism in the church. It was part of his contraceptive mentality that John Paul felt that the West was trying to foist contraception on the developing world. And we just passed the 20th anniversary of the Cairo Conference on Development, and that was just roiled by that issue of the Vatican saying, you are trying to push family planning on the developing world, and they don't want it. They value big families, they value traditional roles for women, and you have no right to push this on people. And there is, I don't believe that charge was true. They certainly weren't trying to push mandatory contraception, but there is definitely a clash of ideologies here that is very real.
Right. But I think also the Cairo Conference was extremely controversial because, for, advocates for women's rights and even people involved in development issues and economic development issues, contraception is a key component of getting out of poverty in many places in the world, including in the United States.
Right.
And so, it's not just a question of religion and church doctrine, but it's a question of just survival. For many people.
And it was a question of making family planning services available to women within the whole continuum of reproductive health care, which the women's health advocates at that conference were huge on emphasizing. They really wanted to get away from that kind of top-down, population control model of foisting contraception on people. And they pointed to the huge numbers for unmet need for family planning around the world, which is women who desire to use contraception but can't get it. And so they were definitely on the side of the angels in terms of trying to give people more freedom in their lives, more ability to plan their families. But the Catholic Church pulls out that old colonialism charge whenever it can, because it does have some cultural power, I think.
Yeah, no doubt. So here's another... I want to sort of tie this to your book a little bit. You in your book, you provide a really fascinating history of what happened to the early pro-choice Catholic activists and politicians when they came up against church doctrine on abortion and contraception, but initially it was really around the abortion issue. And, the labeling of people who were pro-choice as not being good Catholics, hence the name of the title of your book, the denial of communion to pro-choice politicians and so forth. Do you have any sense that is or will change? I mean, do you think that the Catholic Church is, obviously this whole synod is built around creating a pastoral environment in which all Catholics feel welcome in the church. I mean, I think that's the clear intention, whether they're going to be able to achieve that remains to be seen. But that seems to be the intention. I mean, would that ever come around to including people who were pro-choice, women who've had abortions and, are open about the fact that they had an abortion? Is that something that would ever change? Do you think the Catholic Church has moved beyond what you describe, from the 1960s, 70s, 80s in your book?
Well, I think there's two components to that. One is the component of denying communion to people who are publicly pro-choice. Even Cardinal Dolan, who was one of the more enthusiastic cultural warriors, but seems to have gotten a little religion under Francis, said recently that those days are over. We are no longer going to be doing that. A lot of bishops, even those who are quite conservative, hated that idea. They hated the idea of using communion as kind of a stick rather than a carrot for people. So I think at least as long as Francis is around, there won't be those kind of real hard-line crackdowns. But the reality is abortion is really the third rail for the Catholic Church, and it has become just more and more politicized. Certainly there are lots of openly pro-choice Catholics. They're almost all Democrats. And they go to church and they receive communion, and many of them are active members of their church. But I think it is not going to be something that's going to be discussed openly in the church at any time in the near future. Let's put it that way.
Okay, so that is not on the table.
That is not. If contraception is not on the table, that abortion is definitely not on the table.
But not even. So it's sort of. But so with regard to the gay Catholics, they discuss in the midterm report the gifts that they have to bring. Right. But so that seems to be an explicitly sort of welcoming kind of language. But you don't think that obviously they're not going to change the doctrine on abortion.
Right.
That seems pretty clear. But would they ever have any kind of language that's so explicitly welcoming of somebody of a Catholic who was openly pro-choice?
I don't know. They do have language actually that explicitly welcomes women who have abortions. The church is very happy to welcome back people who've had abortions and provide pastoral care to women who have abortions. So they're not really against people having abortions and then returning to the church or being in the church. It is hard for me to imagine that they would embrace publicly pro-choice Catholics. It is because it is such a question of authority for the church. The bottom line is people can use birth control. They can do it in the privacy of their own home. No one has to know. Most Catholics don't consider that a sin. One of the bishops was actually complaining at the synod that people use birth control and don't even confess it in confession because they just don't consider that a sin. But similarly, people can have an abortion or vote for a pro-choice candidate and never have to talk about it in their church. So I think it's one of those things that's just going to remain kind of don't ask, don't tell, maybe is the best we can hope for on that. But if someone is publicly pro-choice, that has always come down to a question of the Vatican's authority over Catholics because they are so publicly going against an issue which the Vatican has said over and over again is the deal breaker for Catholics. Remember, the Catholic Church is against abortion in all circumstances. They are farther to the right on this than any of, almost even the most hard-right Christian right on this. They do not even think a woman whose life could be saved by an abortion should have an abortion. So it is not something that I see in any time in the near future they're going to give an inch on. They may decide to tone down the rhetoric, to ignore it a little bit more officially, but I think this is just a long-term stalemate for the church at this point.
Okay. Now, what about divorce? And because that is something that has been discussed at the synod, and because people who are divorced cannot receive communion.
If they remarry.
If they remarry,
because they are technically living in adultery as far as the church is concerned, because the church doesn't recognize divorce.
So do you think that's something that's going to change?
I think that's the area where there seems to be a little wiggle room around. The area that most definitely looks like it will change is making annulments easier to get. Even the conservatives are kind of for that as long as it's within certain grounds. The Catholic Church loves annulment because it just says your marriage never existed and then the problem of divorce and communion goes away. So there's and Pope Francis has already appointed a committee to look into that and come up with new procedures that might even allow new conditions for annulment, like we were too young and didn't know any better, which could probably describe every bad first marriage that anyone ever had. And so that there's a lot of energy around that. The liberals, Pope Francis and Casper, are pushing for, it would not be a blanket dispensation that people who were remarried could get communion, but for very much like a local solution. Whereas if you were part of your church life and you knew your bishop or your priest and they knew the circumstances you were in, and they felt like you were sufficiently pendant from having been divorced, they could approve you receiving communion kind of on a local one-on-one basis. That's very much the model Francis is kind of putting forward on everything, which is a very Catholic thing. It devolves the power back to the local bishop and priests, and it takes into account each local pastoral situation. It's not just like a blanket dispensation. That sounds very reasonable. It sounds like something everyone should be able to agree on. But again, the conservatives, they see that as just, as anarchy in the church, actually.
So do you see Francis as kind of the common ground pope? Because it seems like he wants to keep the traditionalists happy and keep them in the fold, but he also wants people who have stepped outside church teaching, which on the contraception issue,
is everyone,
the vast majority of American Catholics, at least. Is there a way to reconcile these things and have these two types of people be comfortable being part of the same church family? Or are you going to see, do you think he's going to be able to do that? Or are you going to see a sort of split in the sense that you'll see the traditionalists attending churches belonging to parishes where a much more traditionalist mindset and liturgy practiced, and the more liberal folks are going to go to the more liberal parishes? Or do you think that there's going to be, do you foresee him creating a sort of environment where everybody can worship together?
Well, that's a great question. I think you already see a lot of that. The liberals go to their churches, which are often welcoming of gay and lesbian couples, and divorced people probably take communion and nobody really worries about it. And the conservatives can go to their Latin Mass and do all their conservative things. So I think you already do see a lot of that in the church. It's fascinating to me because I think that question and this split very much parallels the political situation in this country. Francis is trying to be very common ground. The things he's put forward in this synod are very modest proposals. They are really proposals that everyone should be able to gather around. But the hardliners, much like kind of hardliners, conservatives in this country, are really, they believe that giving any ground is just the beginning of the slippery slope towards complete cultural and sexual anarchy. And they just seem to want to refuse to make any condensations to this at all, which is kind of silly. Why would you have a synod if you're not going to change anything, even the tiniest bit of pastoral practice? It's illogical that the church could never change anything, but they've really hung their hat on that. A priest wrote into, I think it was Crisis magazine, which is a conservative Catholic magazine, and complained that just in the last week, a divorced man has shown up wanting to take communion, and a young couple who are living together want to get married in the church and came to the church together and openly admitted they were living together. And he said, they both said Pope Francis said it was okay. And he was horrified. And Pope Francis is saying, don't be horrified. We want people to come to the church. It's actually what we do. We are in the business of helping people and serving people.
Right. Fascinating. Well, listen, thank you so much for illuminating all of these subjects for us today.
Thank you, Sarah.
This is Good Catholics by Patti Miller. And hopefully we'll have a chance to chat again soon.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks.